The doctors had already pronounced her dead, but then a 10-year-old girl in a thrift store jacket walked in and changed everything. 4 minutes. That's how long 9-month-old Lily Sterling's heart had been still by the time Dr. Patricia Nguyen raised both hands, palms out, and said the words she hated saying more than any other words in medicine. Compressions had done nothing. 2 rounds of epinephrine had done nothing. A resident named Josh Kavanaugh kept glancing at the clock like it might change its mind. Time of death, Nguyen said, and her voice cracked on the word death in a way 12 years of practice hadn't trained out of her. In the corner of the room, Arthur Sterling stood with both hands pressed over his own mouth so hard his knuckles had gone bloodless. Outside, on Chicago Financial News, his name meant Sterling Capital Group, 2 buildings downtown, a fortune that showed up in half the pension funds in Illinois. In this room, it meant nothing. He was just a father watching his daughter go still. Nobody saw the door open. Hospital security would spend the next hour trying to explain how a 10-year-old girl got past 2 checkpoints and a nurse's station without a badge scanning or an alarm sounding, and none of them would have a good answer. Because the truth was that Chloe Bennett had been sitting in the hallway for 6 minutes, and something about the way the nurses had gone from moving fast to moving slow told her exactly what had gone wrong before anyone inside that room caught it. Half a second before Nguyen called it, Lily Sterling's left eyelid had twitched. Not a spasm. 2 winters of reading pediatric neurology out of a stolen textbook under streetlights had taught Chloe exactly what that twitch meant. A brainstem still fighting for a way back. "Stop," Chloe said, and the word was out of her before she'd decided to say it. Nobody stopped, obviously. Why would a room full of board-certified physicians listen to a kid in a thrift store jacket? But Chloe didn't wait for permission a second time. She crossed the room, had Lily out of the bassinet before a nurse could grab her arm, and was already at the scrub sink running the water cold. A security guard caught her by the shoulder and she twisted out of the jacket rather than stop moving. "Get that kid out of here," Nguyen snapped, already turning her team back toward the sink to take the baby back by force if she had to. And that's when Arthur Sterling, a man who had spent 30 years telling other people no, said the only word in that hospital that mattered. Letter. His voice broke in half saying it. 40 seconds. That's how long the room held its breath, while Nguyen's team stayed close enough to grab the baby the instant this went wrong. And then Lily Sterling gasped, one raw, furious breath, and started to scream. It was, without question, the best sound any of them had ever heard a baby make. "Who let a child into my resuscitation room?" Nguyen's voice came out sharper than she meant it. Nobody answered. The nurses looked at each other. Kavanaugh looked at the door like he'd imagined the whole thing. And Chloe Bennett, 10 years old, still holding a screaming, very alive baby against her chest, stopped looking like a miracle and started looking like exactly what she was. A scared kid who'd just broken about 6 hospital policies and had no idea what happened to kids who did that. Arthur crossed the room in 3 steps and took his daughter out of her arms, and for one strange second the billionaire and the street kid just stared at each other. He got as far as opening his mouth. Then the radio started. Security, a second doctor, somebody saying, "Unauthorized minor, how did she get back here?" into a shoulder-mounted radio like it was an emergency of its own. Chloe had spent 2 years learning exactly what happens to kids without an address when uniforms start asking questions, so she did the only thing her body knew how to do. She ran, not toward the crowd, low and fast between 2 gurneys, through a service corridor she'd clearly scouted coming in, out a fire door into an alley off Erie Street where the wind off the lake cut through her jacket like it wasn't there. A guard made it 2 steps behind her and lost her at the mouth of the alley. All that was left was a half-melted puddle of slush with one boot print pressed into it. Back inside, Arthur stood holding his living, breathing, screaming daughter, and something came apart in his chest that had nothing to do with relief. "Find her," he told the room. "I don't care what it costs." He had no idea yet how much it would cost, or how long it would actually take. to find one specific kid that all of Chicago had somehow managed not to see for 2 straight years. 2 years earlier, in a 2-bedroom apartment on the South Side, Chloe Bennett had a little sister named Maddie Bennett, 6 years old, obsessed with dinosaurs, and allergic to peanuts badly enough that the whole family had built their lives around it the way you build your life around a fault line, hoping it never moves. One Tuesday it moved anyway. Nobody ever figured out exactly how peanut oil got into the food at Maddie's after-school program. What mattered was that the ambulance was coming from across the district, because that's just how it went in that neighborhood. Everybody knew it, and nobody fixed it. And by the time it arrived, Maddie's throat had already closed. "She can't breathe! She can't breathe! Somebody help her!" 9-year-old Chloe screamed into a kitchen that had nobody in it who knew what to do, including her. She counted every one of those minutes on her knees on the cracked linoleum. Maddie died before the ambulance made it to the end of the block. Their father lost his job to drinking within 2 months. Their mother had been hiding an illness of her own to keep her daughters from worrying, and stopped fighting it not long after Maddie's funeral. By the time Chloe turned 9, there was no apartment left and no relative able or willing to take her in. And somewhere between one overwhelmed caseworker and the next, she slipped through and the city swallowed her. She didn't cry about it in front of anyone. What she did, kneeling on that kitchen floor the night Maddie died, was make herself one promise, silently, because she didn't need to say it out loud to mean it. She was going to learn everything there was to know about how a body worked and failed and could be saved. So she never again knelt over somebody she loved without knowing what to do. Teaching yourself pediatric medicine with no home, no library card, and no family sounds impossible, until you understand what Chloe was actually willing to do about it. Twice a week, she checked the dumpsters behind the buildings near the Illinois Medical District, because college students threw out an unbelievable number of textbooks every December. Anatomy texts, pharmacology guides, a nursing manual missing half its spine. The Latin nearly beat her at first. Whole pages of clinical shorthand that might as well have been a different language. So she taught herself that, too, one root word at a time, out of pamphlets left on chairs in clinic waiting rooms. At night, when the shelters were full or too dangerous to risk, she read under the lights at Millennium Station, knees pulled up against the cold, breath fogging over pages about infant airway obstruction, until she could recite whole chapters silently to herself. She wasn't doing it because she dreamed of becoming a doctor. She was doing it because every night she could still hear that ambulance arriving too late. And the only thing that made it quiet, even for an hour, was learning one more thing that might have saved Maddie. Survival turned into its own kind of curriculum right alongside the medicine. Which guards look the other way? Which soup kitchens serve breakfast on which mornings? How to sleep sitting up against a wall so you looked like you were resting instead of like you had nowhere to go. And somewhere in the middle of 2 brutal years, 3 people noticed her. Not one of them set out to save a baby's life 2 years later. None of them ever found out that they had. Clara Whitfield worked the reference desk at a library branch on the near South Side, and she had exactly one rule she'd followed for over a decade without exception. Withdrawn books went in the recycling bin out back, not into anyone's hands. One October night, locking up late, she found a kid in an oversized jacket crouched by that bin, lifting out a water-stained encyclopedia of emergency medicine like it was something precious. Clara could have told her to put it back. Instead, she thought about her own quiet apartment, her own grown kids who barely called, and said, "Take it. Take whatever you want. Nobody's going to miss it but me." A few blocks over, Marcus Delgado ran a food truck called the Windy City Skillet most evenings, after years as an Army combat medic. He noticed the kid with the too big jacket and the stack of stolen books long before she noticed him. Noticed she never once asked for food, even on nights he could tell she hadn't eaten. So he just started setting an extra plate on the counter without a word and letting her decide. Once she trusted him enough to sit for a few minutes, he pulled a battered teddy bear out of the truck's cab one slow night and used it to show her things the books hadn't quite explained right. how to check an airway, how deep compressions actually needed to go. "Why do you want to know all this?" he asked her once. She didn't answer. He didn't ask again. He had a feeling the answer wasn't one a bowl of soup could fix. So he just kept teaching her, and kept feeding her, and let that be enough. And there was Elena Vasquez, transit security, posted most winter nights near a downtown subway entrance, watching for exactly the kind of trouble a homeless kid could get pulled into after dark. Instead, on the coldest nights, the ones where the wind chill turned dangerous fast, she started quietly waving Chloe past the barriers into an unused equipment room, warm from the machines humming inside it. 1 hour, she'd tell her every time. "I could lose my job for this, so 1 hour, and then you move." She never asked where Chloe's parents were. She just made sure a grieving kid had somewhere warm to read on the worst nights of 2 Chicago winters. None of the three ever met each other. Take away any one of them, and there's no 10-year-old walking into that emergency room already knowing exactly what to do. Finding one kid in a city of 3 million should have been impossible. Except Arthur Sterling had the kind of money that made impossible a much smaller word than usual. He put a private investigations team on it within 2 days and told them cost wasn't a factor. They ran hospital footage frame by frame, canvassed shelters and school records, and still took 3 weeks, partly because 2 of those weeks were burned chasing a different girl entirely, a runaway matching Chloe's rough description, found safe with relatives in Rockford, a dead end that cost them time they didn't have. They finally located Chloe under an overpass near the river, sharing a camp with 2 other kids in situations like hers. And when Arthur showed up alone instead of sending a team, her first instinct was to run again. She didn't this time, mostly because he came by himself, and because the first thing out of his mouth wasn't a single question about the hospital. "Thank you for my daughter's life," he said. "I don't know how to pay that back. I'd like to try, if you'll let me." What followed wasn't a montage. It was months of exactly the kind of wall that swallows kids like Chloe every day. A single man, however wealthy, can't just walk out of a homeless camp with a 10-year-old who isn't his blood. Home studies, background checks, a mandatory waiting period, and in the meantime, the state's answer was temporary group placement while paperwork moved on its own schedule. His attorney, Diane Kessler, told him flatly it could take months, not weeks. "Then it takes months," Arthur said. "That girl isn't spending one more winter under a bridge if I can help it." It took 4 hearings in front of Judge Miriam Ross before the case actually turned. At the 3rd hearing, opposing counsel, hired quietly by Arthur's late wife's sister, Margaret Voss, who thought the whole thing was reckless, argued Chloe should go through standard foster placement first, for everyone's protection. Judge Ross looked at a 10-year-old who just answered a cardiologist question about pediatric shock more precisely than the cardiologist had asked it, and said, "I've been on this bench 19 years. I don't think standard placement protects this child from anything she hasn't already survived on her own." On a gray Tuesday afternoon, she signed the order. Chloe Bennett became, officially, a Sterling. The house had more rooms than Chloe knew what to do with, and a bed so soft it took her 3 weeks to sleep in it instead of on the floor beside it, back against the wall, the way 2 years on the street had trained her body to rest. Housekeepers kept finding crackers stuffed under the mattress and inside jacket pockets, and it took Arthur a long, uncomfortable conversation, one that ended with both of them in tears at the kitchen table, before he understood it wasn't defiance. It was 2 years of never trusting that the next meal was guaranteed. The world outside the house wasn't any softer. At a family dinner not long after the adoption was finalized, Margaret Voss made her opinion clear loud enough for Chloe to hear it from the top of the staircase. "You've lost your mind, Arthur. You don't know anything about this child. What happens when the novelty wears off and she's still here?" Chloe didn't say anything. She just went quieter than she already was, which, for her, was saying something. Arthur found her on the stairs later and sat down next to her instead of standing over her. "She's wrong," he said. "And I mean this. If anyone in this family ever makes you feel like you don't belong in it again, they're not welcome back in this house. I don't care whose sister she is." "You don't have to do that," Chloe said. "I know I don't," he said. "I'm doing it anyway." It took real time, not movie time, but the pieces settled. Chloe claimed an unused library in the East Wing before anyone thought to stop her. She started eating meals at the table instead of standing near the door. Somewhere in that first hard year, Arthur stopped thinking of himself as a man who'd adopted a stranger and started, without ever quite deciding to, thinking of himself as her father. 4 years later, 14-year-old Chloe was quietly at the top of every science class at Ashford Preparatory near Lincoln Park. Still not the kind of kid who talked much in a crowded room. Still working toward the same promise she'd made on a kitchen floor when she was 9. Except now she was doing it with a real transcript instead of a stolen encyclopedia. That autumn, Arthur hosted a charity gala at a hotel ballroom over the Chicago River, raising money for pediatric research, a cause nobody in that room needed explained to them. Among the guests was Diana Whitmore, a well-known name in Chicago philanthropy circles who'd made more than one pointed comment in Arthur's earshot over the years about charity cases and how much pressure it must put on a child, all that attention. She'd never once said it to Chloe's face. She didn't need to. Midway through dinner, Diana Whitmore's fork stopped halfway to her mouth, her hand went to her chest, and she slid sideways out of her chair. The room did the thing rooms full of well-dressed people do in a real emergency. A wave of gasps, chairs scraping back, someone shouting, "Is there a doctor here?" Like shouting alone might produce one. Her lips had already gone faintly blue. Nobody in that ballroom knew about the heart condition she'd been quietly ignoring behind a decade of skipped physicals. Chloe reached her before either of the 2 doctors at the table even stood up. "Move the table. Somebody get the AED from the lobby, now," she said, already checking the pulse at Diana's throat, voice flat and fast and not shaking once. "Call it in. Tell them cardiac. Tell them now, not in a minute." A waiter froze. "Now," Chloe said again, sharper, and he ran. By the time paramedics took over, Diana Whitmore was conscious, breathing, and looking up at the same girl she'd once written off as a rescue project, with an expression she'd remember for the rest of her life. She never apologized out loud for the things she'd said over the years. She didn't have to. Every skeptic in that ballroom had just watched exactly what a so-called charity case could do when it actually mattered. The year Chloe left for Northwestern's Feinberg School of Medicine, she sat down at the desk in her library and wrote 3 letters before she sealed her own acceptance envelope. She hadn't forgotten a single person who'd kept her alive during the 2 years nobody else was looking. And now that she finally had the standing to do something about it, she wasn't waiting any longer. Clara Whitfield had been retired a while by then, living alone in an apartment that had gotten too quiet, wondering some nights if 3 decades behind a reference desk had mattered to anybody at all. She read Chloe's letter twice standing up in her kitchen before she had to sit down, and she kept it in her nightstand drawer for the rest of her life, telling anyone who asked that it was the proudest moment of her career, broken rule and all. Marcus Delgado had been seriously thinking about closing the Windy City skillet. Rising costs, a body that ached more after 20 years between the truck and the army before it. Chloe didn't just mail him a letter. She showed up at the truck in person on a Tuesday evening, ordered the same thing she used to order for free, and slid an envelope across the counter with an offer to fund a second truck outright. "One condition," she said. "Keep a teddy bear in the cab. Always. For whoever's next." He read it right there with the grill still running behind him and had to turn around for a second so she wouldn't see his face. Elena Vasquez had spent the last couple of years wondering if a career in transit security had amounted to much more than a paycheck. Chloe's letter answered a question she hadn't realized she'd been asking herself. That 1 hour of warmth, given at real risk to her own job, had helped keep a grieving kid alive long enough to save a baby years later. Elena requested a transfer not long after, not away from her post, but toward a new outreach program connecting homeless youth with shelter during Chicago winters. 3 letters, 3 people who'd quietly started to doubt whether any of it had mattered, all getting the same answer at once. It had traveled further than any of them could have guessed. Lily Sterling turned 5 on a bright, cold Saturday in a backyard strung with lights. Healthy, loud, completely unaware of how close her story had once come to ending before it started. She doesn't remember any of it. She was 9 months old. What she knows is simpler, that her big sister Chloe answers the phone no matter how busy she gets, and that it was Chloe who taught her how to blow out 5 candles in one breath instead of 2. Arthur stood at the edge of that yard watching both his daughters and let himself stop, just for a second, in the middle of a workday he'd normally never pause for. He'd built an empire over 30 years, made deals that made headlines in every financial paper in the country, and he'd tell anyone who asked, without hesitating, that none of it came close to the value of one decision he made in a hospital corridor: to not let a scared kid in a second-hand jacket disappear back into a Chicago winter. Chloe's in medical school now, closer every semester to becoming exactly what she promised a dying 6-year-old she'd become, on a kitchen floor in a life that some days feels like it belonged to somebody else. She still has that jacket. It hangs in her closet, not because she needs it, but because she never wants to forget where she started, or how many small, unglamorous people it took to get her out. It was never really about a billionaire or a mansion or good enough lawyers. It was about a librarian who broke a rule, a medic who taught a lesson with a teddy bear, a guard who risked her job for an hour of warmth, and a grieving kid who turned an unbearable loss into a promise she refused to break. If you believe that even the smallest act of kindness can change the world, let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more stories.